going live on Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. I've just done a deep dive on some blood work and I wanted to share that. Lord only knows if we are actually live. Okay. Let us see. Okay, we are live. Amazing. When tech is on your side, isn't that just the most wonderful feeling? Because I feel as though so much time is spent trying to get all of the technologies and softwares on the same page, and sometimes they just don't want to work. So if you're watching on YouTube, Facebook, or LinkedIn, you will see my screen share. If not, then you're watching from Instagram. Hello to Instagram. Thank you for watching. So I've recently done a deep dive on some blood work and I wanted to share some findings. I'm not going to share whose blood work it is. The person remains anonymous. But what I want you to know and understand is that I often analyze people's blood work. And whilst a lot of the time it comes back with nothing terribly obvious or conclusive, with the parameters that I use and with what I'm looking to see, I often see at least 8 biomarkers which are off. They're out of range. They are not optimal. Now, if you're looking to perform your best, feel your greatest, strongest, if you're making $1 million decisions every other day of the week, then you need to be getting all 1,000 horsepower out of the car that you are, okay? Out of the machine that you are. You need all of it to work. You cannot possibly get the most out of yourself if you're only using 100, let alone 10 horsepower, if you have the capacity to be 1,000. So I wanted to break down some of my findings and compare what the lab reported and what the doctor reported versus what I'm noticing here. Now, full context, I have a degree in public health. I am a certified sports nutritionist, a certified health coach, and a personal trainer with about 14 years and 16,000 hours of experience. I'm not a doctor. I do have some close peers and friends who are, and I do my best to cross-reference everything that I suggest to my clients through them first. So I use them as my filter of sorts. And I do, of course, refer my clients to them, to my trusted allied health professionals and medical professionals. So take what you will from this. Again, you should always consult your medical practitioner first because that is not me. I can help you in a number of ways, but I do see some things which I just, hi mom. Oh, mom's watching. We gotta take a moment for B-Dog, Bonnie Phillips. She's the greatest. So I was mentioning you should always consult with your preferred medical professional. Full disclaimer, I am not one, but I do my best to give the most accurate health information possible because I want people to be their healthiest self. Yes, my mom writes she did it, and then she immediately loses connection to the live stream. Well done. Good on her. She's done well to be this tech savvy at this age and stage in life. So again, if you're watching from YouTube, LinkedIn, and Facebook, you will get my screen share. If not, you're watching from Instagram, in which case you will not. But if you want a breakdown of my findings, I'm happy to pass you a personalized video. I can give you a little snapshot tour, if you will. Just comment the word blood work and I'll send that over to you, okay? So we're going to start from the start because, of course, that's a very good place to start. And if we look at this person's lipid profile, what is interesting to me is that the lab and the doctor flagged their lipid markers as being elevated, particularly their LDL and their total cholesterol, which is not what I'm actually noticing here. Mom, it's fine. I can see you. You're good. 2 thumbs up. So I have a little bit of a different take on cholesterol. I think the wrong things get flagged. Full stop. I think the wrong things get flagged, and I don't think full context really gets read into when we relay this information back to the client. So what I often notice is that doctors seem and appear to look at total cholesterol and LDL, and if that seems slightly off, apparently then the person has a cholesterol issue. And that's, in my opinion, just simply not the case, okay? a few things to factor in here. Whether the person has fasted, whether the person has exercised prior to having the blood work done. If they haven't been fasting, what have they eaten? Was it of a higher fat content? What did they eat the night beforehand? What is their fiber intake like? That's a really huge one, which I think gets overlooked massively. What are their other hormone profiles looking like? So what is their testosterone like? Also, what is their vitamin D like? Because I see improvements in lipid profile just by addressing vitamin D. And of course, in this part of the world, although it's sunny a lot of the time, and I look at my window and see clouds and a storm rolling in, most people in Singapore are vitamin D deficient. And if not deficient, they're certainly low. So when we talk about vitamin D, I like to see between 50 and 70. Now, unfortunately, that was just not even taken. So another thing that I'll point out to you is that a lot of helpful markers are simply not included in standardized blood work. And that's why I partner with a clinic and I send my clients to a particular clinic in Singapore because they run the exact blood profile and panel that I like to see. It includes all the helpful stuff and none of the not helpful stuff. So I can only help a person if I see the right measurements. And what is interesting and annoying is that vitamin D is completely omitted from this. And vitamin D is a really important and helpful marker, especially as it relates to energy levels, as it relates to mood, as it relates to hormone profile. We really need those insights. And it's not even here. So I can't really have a full interpretation of what I'm seeing because that's simply omitted. So cholesterol, to me, based on what I'm seeing, which again, if you're watching on YouTube, LinkedIn, and Facebook, you'll see what I'm seeing. Their total cholesterol is actually fine. The LDL, so low density lipoprotein, which is typically classified as the bad cholesterol, is towards the higher end of the healthy range. Now, family history can come into this, genetics can come into this, certainly. This person, relatively speaking, has a fairly good diet. I mean, they're not eating like 400 grams of pork belly every single day. So they're not eating a lot of fried foods or fat from meat, for example. So I'm not particularly worried about that. And I know they're making really positive health changes. Their HDL, so the high density lipoprotein, is actually towards the lower end of the healthy range. Their TC to HDL ratio, which to me is a much more important biomarker and more helpful biomarker to look at than simply cholesterol in and of itself, is not bad. It's 4.5. I would prefer that to be under 3.5 is really good. It's currently at 4.5. So again, slightly elevated. What is interesting is that their triglycerides are a bit higher than what I would like to see. And again, who knows how much vitamin D can be impacting that right now because we just don't have that marker in the first place. A few other things that can contribute to that, which if you're watching, you should probably take note of this, can be alcohol, can be excess fructose. So if you drink a lot of juices or very, very sweet drinks, which contain actual sugars and sweeteners, that can be a contributing factor. Obesity, carrying excess weight, also having low triglyceride clearance. So someone who doesn't eat a lot of seafood is likely to have this appear in their blood work, which is why it can be really important to supplement these things. But it's also why we need to test first. Otherwise, you could be spending a lot of money on supplements which aren't going to move the needle. And you just don't have time for that, okay? So we'll get into that a little bit later. Other things that can impact the triglycerides can be HbA1c, which we'll get into. And as I mentioned, fasting, insulin, so glucose. Again, a diet which is high in desserts, sugary drinks, alcohol, just frequent snacking, soft drinks can be a contributing factor to that. Potentially, and depending on the context, also ferritin, so stored iron, which we'll get into later, because that does appear quite a lot for this person. Moving on from that, I want to go into just general red and white blood cell markers. So what we're seeing here, MCH, MCHC, are both, MCH, MCV are both low. And that can lead us to think that potentially this person will want to look into their ferritin. Annoyingly, again, this is another marker that wasn't tested, and this is why I'm very particular with who I send my clients to when they're having their blood work done. Because again, you can only make change based on the metrics that you measure, okay? What you test gets measured. Isn't that something that someone said once? And if you're not testing the right things, how are you to know what to look out for, okay? So MCH and MCV, actually MCV here is fine, but there are signs along the way that this person would want to look into their ferritin. Yeah, so high RDW and normal MCV may suggest nutritional deficiencies. High RDW, which this person has, an elevated CRP or ESR. CRP and ESR are inflammatory markers. Now, we do have a marker for ESR here, but not CRP, which is a little bit annoying because ESR is just a little bit slower as it relates to actually like showing signs of iron deficiency or inflammation rather. So CRP doesn't take quite as long to show those changes, whereas ESR does. You know, when you test something, you have to remember that it takes a while for things to turn up in the body's chemistry before you actually see it in a number from blood work. So that's just a little bit frustrating. But again, this is why we pay attention to what we test. Interestingly, this person's hemoglobin is also slightly low, which again lends my line of thinking to their ferritin needing to be addressed. So that being stored iron. Now, how do you know if you are low in iron? What should you look out for? If you have chronic lethargy, you get out of breath really easily. So if you were to run to catch the bus, for example, walk up 2 flights of stairs, you're feeling puffed and out of breath. If you feel like you have brain fog, you just can't put clear thoughts together. They are the 3 main symptoms of being low in iron. And what really bugs me, and what should bug you as well, is that the reference ranges we see on blood work for ferritin, which is again stored iron, is completely off. It's completely off. Blood work will be stated as 30 to 300 for ferritin. We get symptoms from 60 and below. So why do we have a reference range between 30 and 300? Reference ranges are often just population averages. And that's not what we want to aim for. If your average population is unhealthy, why are we aiming for average? That, my friends, is not the goal, okay? So ferritin, from 60 and below, you get symptoms. Ideally, you want ferritin to be at least 100. You know, that way we have a buffer. Now, if you exercise more, if you have a heavy menstrual cycle, if you've had multiple deliveries, so if you've delivered a child, whether quote unquote naturally or otherwise, if there's been excessive blood loss through, you know, a surgery, elective surgery, then these are all contributing factors to having low iron. And the downstream effects of that are really serious. So you feel like you're pushing yourself in the gym and you're just plateauing, you're sore all the time, restless leg syndrome, if you're craving earthy flavors, so like bitter things like dirt, dark chocolate, you want to chew ice, that's a really big one as well. These are all symptoms of having low iron. And unfortunately, I see this all too often. I would say all but 2 women I've trained in the last 14 years have had sufficient iron. And that's just not okay. That's not good enough, okay? So that's a huge one to look out for. So essentially the body is not able to get as much oxygenated blood carried through the body when we have low iron, so especially low ferritin, which is the stored iron. The tricky thing with this is you can also have fine hemoglobin. You can have totally fine serum iron, which reflects what is circulating. But if your stored iron is low, you can still suffer in silence. And often we suffer for 10 to 15 years before this is sufficiently detected and addressed. Now, in Singapore, thankfully, it's not too hard to get an infusion. Typically, we'll recommend an infusion if your levels are really low. If not, sometimes we can have an oral supplement, so we can take liquid iron. It just depends on where your levels currently sit. Though for those who are really, really low, we do recommend an infusion. It's just really hard to absorb through the stomach. And by the time your levels actually come up to what is sufficient, it's just going to take so long. It honestly takes such a long time to get those levels up. So usually the easiest way is to bypass the digestion and just go straight into the bloodstream. I've personally done 2 of them, and I really, really recommend it, especially if you're looking to perform in the gym and in the boardroom. So moving along, we are seeing this person has an okay red blood cell count, slightly elevated, could be due to ferritin. Their white blood cell count is slightly high. Now, this could be because they had a recent infection, if they were recently unwell. Typically, white blood cells are going to go off, and it's an indication of our immune system usually. So the more white blood cell activity there is, typically the more likely we are to be fighting something off. We could be chronically stressed, have inflammation, have an infection, might have a cold or a flu. Maybe you've been traveling extensively and you've just come from a completely different climate. These could all be contributing factors. So that's why we're seeing that this person's neutrophils are high, which is a type of red blood cell. Thankfully, their lymphocytes are fine, and their monocytes are slightly elevated. Eosinophils are fine, basophils are fine, MCV is fine, towards the lower end of the healthy range, I will say. And their RDW, as I mentioned, is slightly elevated. Again, could lend our line of thought to looking at stored iron. Platelets are high. Okay, we want to see between 200 and 300. I'm seeing 354 here. So that's a slight reason for concern. Again, it could be because they've been dealing with chronic stress, inflammation, infection, all the above. And again, if they've traveled, I say that because in Singapore, obviously people travel far and wide and often. That could be a reason why. So their body's been under stress. But platelets, we don't want to see them too high for too long. It's generally not a good thing. Moving on to thyroid markers. So thankfully their free T4 is fine. TSH is fine. Because of that, T3 we probably can assume is okay. I wouldn't mind honestly seeing what their testosterone is. I think that's always a really nice one just to check. And I like to see that alongside vitamin D2, D also. So we see that there's often there's a positive relationship between having healthy testosterone and vitamin D and testosterone. We don't see, unfortunately, SHBG, so sex hormone binding globulin, which basically helps the body to carry these things around. Okay, so in a lot of instances, we have what is stored within the body, whether that's bone, muscle, or otherwise, and then we have what is circulating. So this is just an indication of the body's ability to get these hormones moving around the body. And unfortunately, that's not being tested. Again, this is why I'm very particular about who I send my clients to. There's sex, SHBG, sex hormone binding globulin. So it's a protein made by the liver that binds sex hormones such as testosterone and estrogen and affects how much of the hormone is circulating in a free, biologically available manner. So it's one thing to have something, it's another thing to be able to utilize it, right? You aren't what you eat, you are what you absorb. So it's a similar principle in that way. If we go into the kidney markers, as well as bladder, we see some of their electrolytes are high. So that gets me wondering, what is the potential reason? Is this diet? Has the person been sick and had nausea? Have they been vomiting? Have they had diarrhea? Their sodium is definitely a little bit elevated, as well as their potassium, as well as their chloride, and their their serum bicarbonate is ever so slightly low. Something to be mindful of, if these things are elevated for prolonged periods of time, it could have a negative impact on the kidneys, the renal system, which we, of course, want to be mindful of. Now, they're not off the charts, but they're also not exactly where we want them to be right now. So something to pay attention to, I would definitely be steering away from electrolyte-based drinks. So looking at things like niacin, I'd be avoiding too much potassium, too many bananas. I would be mindful of that. Salty food, I'd be mindful of salty food intake and keeping a close eye on this. It can also be an indication of adrenal fatigue and stress. So if someone's been through a stressful period in life, if they're going through a lot mentally and emotionally speaking, that could be a contributing factor in this. And it would be interesting to know what their glutathione is, because that's the body's most abundant antioxidant. So if their uptake of glutathione and utilization of glutathione is elevated, well, then their markers would be depleted. You would assume you would see a low glutathione reading on their Bloodwork. So that would be an interesting thing to test. It's not on here, but I would suspect, based on sodium, potassium, and chloride being elevated, that it would be low. So that just means the body is needing to use more antioxidants to stave off and mitigate the impact of that stress. Okay. It would also be interesting to see their vitamin C, which I think is a little tricky to test with blood work. You can look at leukocytes and plasma ascorbic acid. So L-ascorbic acid is a fancy way of saying vitamin C, because we know that that facilitates the absorption of iron. And again, there's a few things on here which lead me to believe this person could be low in iron. So it would be very interesting to look at their vitamin C levels, being another antioxidant, as well as their glutathione levels, being the body's most readily available antioxidant. If they're using a lot of it really, really quickly, I would assume their levels would be on the low side. Looking at liver markers, so we're seeing a few markers here that are out of range, out of the quote-unquote ideal range. We're seeing that ALP, so that's alkaline phosphate, is noticeably low. That's not great. We want between 65 and 100. It's currently at 51. So that's a mineral that contributes to bone integrity, density, structure, cell production, function, as well as energy production. I think I already said that. So that's definitely something to look into on a deeper level. Their GGT is slightly elevated, not substantially. Their ALT is also slightly elevated, not massively. GGT, being an enzyme produced by the liver, can increase with alcohol intake or fatty liver. So something to be mindful of here, as well as ALT being a little on the high side. Sorry, I just said that. GGT, which is an enzyme also produced in the liver. So something to pay attention to, especially if you consume alcohol on a regular basis, and if your body doesn't process alcohol very well. As it relates to fatty liver, I did actually go ahead and test this person's risk for fatty liver, non-alcoholic fatty liver, and they are on the high side. They had a risk rating of 61, and that comes back as being high. Okay, so the markers that go into that are your triglycerides, your BMI, your GGT, and there's one other marker which I'm forgetting. Height. I think it's your height. No, your waist circumference. Okay. Your GGT, your waist circumference, as well as your triglycerides, all contribute to your fatty liver risk. And yeah, 61 is high. So I don't like that I'm seeing these liver markers be even slightly elevated because of that. I think that's definitely something to pay attention to. Now, what contributes to that? So when we take in carbohydrates and the body breaks them down and does their thing with them, if we don't have enough muscle mass to store the glycogen, then the body turns towards the liver to store the excess. So that's one of the many reasons why having sufficient muscle mass is really, really important. There's a few ways to test how much muscle mass you actually have. Now, not fat-free mass. It's not entirely the same thing. What you can do is use a DEXA scan, that appendicular lean tissue. So basically, the tissue from your arms and your legs, what is calculated as being muscle from your arms and your legs, you can then make a bit of a presumption as it relates to the trunk and how much of that is muscle mass to figure out your total lean muscle mass. It's a bit of a high standard, but I like to see that number be as close to 40% of your total weight as possible. That's where we want to be in order to know that we are sufficiently muscled. Most of us are nowhere near that, like nowhere near that. And so then you can't choose to have a high carbohydrate, high alcohol, high sugar, high processed food based diet if you don't have the muscle tissue to support that. Because again, the excess glucose is going to get stored in your liver. If there's not enough muscle to support that, it goes to the liver, it becomes fatty liver. Yeah. So not a good thing, not something that you want for yourself, and definitely why we pay attention to these liver markers. Looking at this person's bone and joint markers, so thankfully their calcium is within range. Phosphate is clearly, I need to go back and look at the recommended range for that. From memory, that was fine. Uric acid is fine. And annoyingly, their folate was not tested. Again, this is why I'm very particular about who I send my clients to get tested. Because when basic things like this are not tested, it's just hard to have a comprehensive understanding of how to help this person. You know, what do they need? What gaps do we need to fill? It's very challenging to make sense of that when we don't have those insights. So folate is a B vitamin. It's vitamin B9. And it's used for DNA production, red blood cell formation, normal cell division. So being low in vitamin B9 can contribute to anemia. Anemia is just a fancy way. It's a collective term for being low in iron. There's different types of anemia. Again, there's enough on these results for me to think that this person is low in iron. So yeah, just challenging that we don't have those insights. Looking at metabolic markers, so thankfully that HbA1c is fine. That's a test, basically average of blood glucose level, roughly over the last 2 or 3 months. So we love that. We want the body to be responsive to glucose and to have a healthy relationship with glucose, okay? So this is why I usually recommend that you match carbohydrates with movement. If you want to have a big carbohydrate meal, match it with exercise. So use that to fuel your training. Use that to fuel your movement, your exercise, your rigorous activities. But if you're going to have like a massive carb-rich meal and then stay still, probably going to feel a bit sluggish. And unless you have a massive physical event to recover from, such as, for example, a high rocks or a marathon or some other competitive event, chances are you just don't need that intensity or concentration of carbohydrates just because it's a Sunday afternoon. Okay. And I recently did actually used a continuous glucose monitor. It was super interesting to see the changes to my blood sugar in real time. I really, really, really recommend, if you're curious about it, that you go and do it. So this person's metabolic markers, thankfully we're fine. Fasting glucose was fine. At the higher end of the healthy range, I will say, but still fine. Some things to be mindful of. As I mentioned, if we look at some of the patterns that we saw earlier, definitely looking into iron. So that's something that I've recommended that they get tested for, especially their ferritin. I would also look at TIBC or transferrin. We're noticing some signs of chronic inflammation and or infection. So I know they were a little bit unwell when I saw them not too long ago, and I'm just trying to recall if they had their blood work taken whilst they were unwell, because that's going to impact their readings. So we should also make mention how we test is really important too. The conditions under which you test are really important. Were you fasting? Were you taking supplements beforehand? Did you exercise that morning? What was your headspace like? Have you been going through a stressful period in the last day, week, month, quarter, year? All of that can contribute to the results that you get on your blood tests, okay? Which is why it's also important to retest and make note of your state that morning, that day. Again, I did calculate their fatty liver risk, and it was high. As I mentioned, some of their biomarkers, their liver markers, were on the slightly elevated side. So their GGT and their ALT being elevated slightly, their alkaline phosphatase, so ALP, being significantly enough to notice, low. Okay, so definitely something to look into. And with iron, we do want to look at vitamin C as well, because vitamin C impacts your ability to absorb and utilize iron. I would like to also understand what their magnesium level is like, given that a lot of their other electrolytes were out of range. And I always like to see vitamins B6, 9, and 12 tested. So unfortunately, that was just not included on the test. I, from here, would be recommending that they look a little deeper into their lipid profile. So APOB, lipoprotein, and non-HDL-C. As I mentioned, I'd be looking at their ferritin, TIBC, transferrin, reticulocyte count, and leukocyte. So leukocyte being vitamin C. As previously mentioned, their SHBG and testosterone. I just like to know these things. I like these insights. I find that they're helpful, especially because vitamin D wasn't tested. I would like to see testosterone and vitamin D. I think both would be really, really helpful. And HSCRP, because it's a bit of a faster insight and indication as to a person's inflammation over the ESP, which is just a little bit slower to change. So things might be changing within you, but it's not showing on the blood work because it just takes longer for that change to appear on blood work, if that makes sense. Folate, yeah, B vitamins, as I mentioned, and serum magnesium. Based on these insights, here are the supplements I would be recommending. So psyllium husk for the cholesterol. So as I mentioned, a lot of quote unquote cholesterol issues can be largely addressed by improving your fiber intake. Now, this person actually does do really well with fiber. They eat a ton of veg and berries. And so I think part of what is influencing their results on their current blood work is genetics. It's unfortunate, but we don't get to choose our genetics. We don't get to choose who's in our bloodline. And sometimes it's really, really good, and sometimes it's not so great. We also don't get to choose what we inherit necessarily. So, that's the great thing about friends, right? You get to choose your friends, not your family. So for them, I would look at potentially doing 5 grams of psyllium husk. Just see how they tolerate it. Fiber can be a little bit of a double-edged sword in that some people do well with higher levels. So females, higher end is going to be 30 grams a day. Lower side is going to be 20 grams a day. For me, it's really about finding which part of that scale works best for you. For men, it's going to be 40 grams or 45 grams on the lower side, 50 grams on the higher side. And again, if you do well on the higher end of the healthy range, go for it. If you do better at the lower side, also fine. Not everybody needs 30 grams or 50 grams a day. For some people, higher is actually worse if we talk about digestion and how they experience that. Also, we need to balance that with water intake, because you might do fine on 30 grams a day if you're drinking like 4 liters of water a day. And in Singapore, honestly, if you're an active adult, I think it's justified, because here's the thing. We're always sweating. Always sweating. And if you're sweating, you're losing nutrients. So you need to replace your nutrients at a faster rate. Also, for every liter of fluid you lose through sweat, you need to replace with 2. It's not a 1-to-1 ratio, it's actually a 2-to-1 ratio. So if you were crazy enough to go for a midday run in Singapore, Lord be with you. But what you need to factor in is not just the liter or 1.5 liters, which you lose during that run. And if you are an 80, 90 kilogram gentleman, it is going to be very easy for you to lose 2 liters of sweat in Singapore on a hot and sunny day. Okay, so what does that tell you? You need to replace those 2 liters with 4 liters just to factor in the sweat situation. Okay, so fiber, you also have to factor in the source of the fiber. Also, you have to factor in fluid intake in conjunction with that, and activity levels too. So yeah, something to be mindful of there. I would, for now, just be avoiding electrolytes in excess and supplementing particular electrolytes such as potassium, niacin, looking at calcium, sodium. So I'd be really, really mindful of that because those markers were elevated on this person's blood work. Again, unless I know that that's adrenal fatigue related, or unless I know that's because they've been eating like 2 bananas before every workout every single day, I would want to dive a little bit deeper into those results to find out why those markers are so high and then adjust accordingly based on those findings. So I'd be laying low on any form of sports drinks. I would be laying low on any types of those effervescent hydration tablets. I'd be super mindful of that. Further supplementation, I would be able to make suggestions with more insights. Unfortunately, there's just some critical things missing from this blood work. It's just a bit incomplete. So without those insights, it's very, very challenging to know what to suggest. Again, if I know that their vitamin D is at 20, I would absolutely be recommending supplementing vitamin D. I would definitely be recommending a liquid iron supplement if they're low. If they're really low, I would suggest that we get an infusion. And that's about all that I can recommend based on what I'm currently seeing. I would also make some suggestions based on their training, things to avoid and include. So based on some signs pointing towards adrenal fatigue and also the situation with their electrolytes, I would be avoiding HIIT workouts, so high intensity workouts, 6 a.m. boot camps, 5 a.m. boot camps, things like boxing for now. Also because if this person is low in iron, it's going to be really hard to do anything high intensity. So I would be avoiding excessive cardio, especially at high intensity. So sprinting at 80, 90, 100%, whether that's through running, whether that's swimming, whether that's cycling, I would just be avoiding. I would be avoiding an intensity of above 70% for cardio for now until we have more insights. And I would be trying to include a little bit more mindfulness-based movement, such as Pilates, yoga, Tai Chi, for example, some breath work. Again, some of what I'm seeing on their blood work leads me to think that they may be experiencing a combination of low iron as well as adrenal fatigue, which again is a little bit of an umbrella term. I don't necessarily love the term adrenal fatigue, but with their electrolyte panel as it currently stands and some of their liver markers, that's what I'm starting to think. So again, until I have that clarification, they would be my suggested changes. And with further insights, we would be able to obviously make more specific recommendations. So I hope you found that helpful. Thank you for joining. Thank you for watching. If you're watching on Instagram and you want more insight, just send me the word bloodwork in the DMs and I'll do a little screen recording and send it over to you. If you're watching on Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube, you should be able to see my screen because I am screen sharing. But in any case, if you have questions, if you found this to be helpful and you want someone to take a proper look at your blood work because your results say that you're fine, but you are not, then send me the word bloodwork on any platform, whichever platform you're watching, and I'll send you some more information. So this is something that I do with my clients. I'm Laura Phillips, based in Singapore, Our clients are worldwide. We work with high achieving, high level executives, business owners, entrepreneurs, C-level executives who want to perform better in the boardroom by optimizing their health. So that's where we come into play. So you can only optimize so much if you don't have the right things tested and if you don't optimize these markers that I just ran through, and even the markers that weren't actually tested. So again, there's no point having a 1,000 horsepower car if you only use 100 horsepower or 10 horsepower. Then what is the point? It's like you have a Ferrari, but the speed limit is 50. Okay. And that's what a lot of people are doing with their health and fitness. And that's where my team come in and we help you get the most out of your health so that you can get 16 hours of work done in 14 hours. Might as well, right? So hope you found it to be helpful. If you did, send me a like, send me a comment. If you have questions, send me a message. If you want more information, send me the word Bloodwork on any of the platforms that you're watching from. I look forward to seeing you in the next one, and thank you for being here.